Okay, I hope that was not actively harmful for anyone. So I appreciated this opportunity to sort of invite you into an inquiry that I've been engaging in my own practice, which is around stories and the nature of stories and how stories occupy our lives. We are occupied by stories, and stories occupy us. And they're just really fascinating. There's a wonderful quote by Muriel Ruckheimer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but it says, "The world is not made of atoms, but stories." And to which you might say, well, actually, the world is made of atoms. But that's just one of our favorite stories about how the world is made. And so it's this really fascinating way to sort of look at the world, to evaluate the way that we move in the world. And so I thought first I'd kind of talk about my story in the context of stories. So for as far back as I can remember, just to give you a little bit of even more background, both of my parents are professors. Both of my sisters, my only other two siblings, are also professors. So, stories, we didn't call them that, played a big role at, the dinner table. Intellectual discourse, trying to make sense of the world, be it politics or, philosophy or whatever. It was all about whether or not you could clearly explain what was going on in a way that others could understand. Could you communicate meaning, right? And so for as far back as I can remember, I've been looking for a story that would give me security, that would give me meaning, that made sense, that would explain why I was so unhappy, right? Or why the world seems so insane. And so I would, go on the internet, and I would go to Wikipedia, and I would find a philosophy or a political theory, and I would get really into it, and I would think, oh great, okay, finally, this is it. This is like, Marxism or Kantian philosophy or whatever it is. Finally, I found something that can really give me security. And I would imbibe that. I would consume that, as we heard in the talk. And eventually, I would come to the bottom of it. And I would feel, actually, no, this does not give me security. This isn't enough. This isn't what I was looking for. And I would discard it. And I would go back to Wikipedia and look for a new story, right? And that went on for a while. There are a lot of stories out there, you may have noticed. There are a lot of different stories. There are competing stories. There are people that really believe their stories are that one story, that one true story. And they're willing to defend the truth, the veracity of that story to the death. Because for some reason that will prove that that story is true. And then I found Buddhism and meditation. And I thought, okay, I'll try this story, see where it takes me. And a really fascinating thing began to happen as I sort of engaged with the story of the Dharma, of Buddhism. In that the more that I practiced, the more that I did what the story told me to do, which was like sit down and be silent and like painful though it was, observe my experience, the less I felt compelled by the stories of my life. The less I believed that they could offer me any real security, any real happiness. And so that's interesting. And then eventually, the story of Buddhism began to self-destruct. Like there's some almost internal self-destruct mechanism within that story itself. And then it's like, whoa, well, okay. I mean, I kind of prescribed to this story. It was really doing well. I really thought this was the one. I thought this was the story that was really going to get me there. And now it's kind of like even that story seems to have no ground. And so that's kind of where I'm at as far as, my story of stories. And I'm hoping to leave a lot of time for us to share our stories about the story that I'm telling you. And so you can, there are 50 stories that are happening here about this story that I'm telling you. But I just wanted to share some other kind of reflections on stories. So, we are swimming in stories. And we might think, oh, okay, stories are like, creation myths and folk tales. But it's so much more than that, right? It's like newspaper articles and blogs and how-to manuals and Facebook status updates. Stories that we share with everybody, even if nobody actually cares. Like these stories that fill our lives, that communicate meaning, that we assert our identity through. And in a lot of ways, a story is nothing more than, you might say, like an account of something, right? Like, what are all these unpaid bills here? Tell me about that. Or, why is there something rather than nothing? Tell me a story about that. Or, where do babies come from? Tell me a story about that. What's that story you're going to tell me? And in a very real way, stories teach us what's real, right? What's valuable, and even like what is possible. What is possible. So they can either constrict or expand our sense of possibility through the telling of them. Right? And how many of us here have had the experience of being told a story or reading a story, and all of a sudden we have a new sense of what might be possible for us or for the world. And then we act differently, right? Our actions transform because of a story, this immaterial something that entered into our mind and then became our lives, right? Like, I'm here today, right here, because I went into my college library and happened to pick out a book, and I read a story, and then here I am. The path of my life completely altered because of a story. Stories are unbelievably powerful. And so when we engage in an exercise like we just did, we might find ourselves or we might notice that we are compulsively telling ourselves stories, right? About ourselves. We're telling ourselves stories about ourselves, and we can't really stop. We just can't stop. It's just if you actually really paid attention, there's a weird way in which it feels really good to tell yourself a story. You kind of get, it's serious, it's like being a little high. You're like, oh yeah, okay. And you weave this world, and it's like, this is the world, and it's going to work for me. And then what happens? It just pops. And then you notice, perhaps, this again, it's gone. And I'm back in this, here. And we do this to ourselves, over and over and over again. And it begins to become kind of hilarious. It's like, it's just kind of funny. I mean, what can you do but laugh at it? We're just spinning these stories that, about anything, right? I think it's really interesting. So this word, samsara, right? It's a Buddhist term for this world of suffering. But the literal translation of it is going around and around. Going around and around, right? Which it can feel like. Like that is what it feels like. If you just sit down and like don't do a technique, right? You just sit down and you're just like, all right, world, like, come at me, right? And it's just, you'll just find yourself just going around and around and around and around and around, and you'll rehearse like the same thing in a slightly different way, and you just kind of do it again because you can't help it. You do it again in a slightly different way because you can't help it, and you drop it, and you're like, okay, this is different. Then you do it again, right? And it's just this going around and around and around. It's like, what is that? Why? Why do we do that to ourselves? Seriously, like what is it that compels us to do that? It's a real investigation on this path. It's like, what is it that makes us do that? And so one of the things that Buddhism and, maybe mindfulness or this spiritual path more generally tells us is that, stories are here. We have to reckon with them. But there's one particular story that you really want to look at. You really want to pay close attention to. You really want to dig into it with whatever you got, which is, of course, the story of the self, right? Around which almost all the other stories we tell ourselves are sort of constellated, right? We have this one sort of master story that all other stories sort of secure themselves by latching onto. The story of I'm not good enough, or I could never do this, or I need a new iPhone in order to be happy, right? All of those stories depend on a self, the story of a self. And just like anything else that we tell a story about, we notice that really it's nowhere to be found, right? Like if you really look, like anything you're telling a story about actually with your eyes closed sitting like this, it's not present except in your mind, except as the story. And so the Buddhism really is trying to orient us towards looking at this one core story, and also to drop all other views, which is good too. And so the problem itself isn't so much stories, but in how we relate to them, right? This compulsivity of engaging in stories, of kind of being addicted to stories. And the really tricky part of it, right, is that we don't even often know that they're stories, right? We don't even know they're stories. They're just it's like we put on a pair of tinted glasses a long time ago, and we have forgotten that we're wearing glasses. They're just it's just now the way we see things, right? And so it can be quite startling to take off the glasses. In fact, you might want to put them back on because, it could be very different. Maybe I can't see things the way I used to. I like seeing things the way I used to. That's how I derived my sense of identity. And often a really good teacher will go up to you and say, hey, I noticed that you're wearing these glasses. You might want to take them off. And to which we might say, no. No, I don't think I do. And then, the path unfolds. And so one thing I find especially fascinating about stories in the context of our work here at CML is the relationship between stories and what we sometimes call responsibility here, or what other people might refer to as social justice or cultural change, or maybe just making the world a better place, So we don't just tell stories to ourselves, of course, right? We tell stories to each other. And we are told stories by our culture or by, television, by news programs. And so the task for us is not simply, huge though it is, to learn to work with stories in our own experience, but also to play or work skillfully with the stories that make up our shared reality, right? And just like in our personal practice, a really interesting thing to do is simply to question the stories that are being told, right? So, in my own practice, maybe I'm thinking, and I'll just say this because it's a real story. Like, I really like a new phone, right? I really like that new iPhone. It seems like that would be a nice phone to have. Maybe it would make me happy to have that phone. I don't actually say maybe in my head. I say that will make me happy. But and so then, when that story's playing in your head, you can say, really? If you have the wherewithal, you can say, really? Like, really? Is that going to make you happy? Is that true? You don't even have to get an answer to it, right? You don't even need to say, no, it's not true, or, well, it might be true, or something like that. Just asking the question itself destabilizes the story to the point where it can start to fade away, right? Because most of the time that stories are a problem, it's because we don't even question them. We're just like slaves to them. We don't even think about it, right? We don't even try to question them. We're just like, okay, story, whatever you say. I guess I'll go buy an iPhone, right? And millions of us do that every day. We unquestioningly obey the demands of the stories we tell ourselves. Not so different culturally, right? So a great example of this that I'm really interested in is turn on any news channel where they're talking about economics, right? Or about national economics. And they'll say something like, I have no idea if this is accurate, like GDP grew 6% this year, like hooray. Or GDP grew 2%, that wasn't so good, we really need to grow more, right? Or they'll say, we need more production or more this, never questioning the story of growth, right? Nobody on CNN, they're not talking about a jobs report and whether or not it means that the economy is going to grow, and they're like, well, hold on now a second, what if we're good how we are? What if we actually don't need to grow the economy right now, right? Nobody ever questions that story on CNN. You will notice. If you see them doing that, let me know, because that would be fascinating to me. But or another great story. I was an organizer at Occupy Wall Street, right? And so a lot of stories got questioned there. One of the stories that got questioned there was the story of ownership, right? This very core story to our sort of national mythos, our modern worldview. And so to question the myth or the idea, the story of ownership, right? That anybody can own anything. What's that like? That is a very deeply rooted story. And just in the act of saying it's a story, that's very powerful. Because most people just take it for granted. They don't see it as a story. They see it as the way things are, just like the way we see the world personally, right? We see things, we think, the way they are, but of course, we don't. So the fascinating thing about this practice in relationship to stories is that we see the groundlessness of them all, right? That they aren't real, in a sense. In a very real sense, they're not real, right? And that very emptiness, that very unreality, that very mirage-like, dream-like nature of stories implies a sense of malleability. It implies a sense of that you can kind of do with it what you want, right? And so it opens up an opportunity for us to more consciously tell stories, to be conscious about the stories we tell ourselves, and to be conscious about the stories we tell each other, and to be conscious of the stories we tell as a culture, as a people, right? So if the world is made of stories, to whatever degree we see that or know that to be true, if the world is made of stories, then therefore we can create a new world with new stories. Right? That's huge. Huge information, huge thing to know. And so in the endeavor to be more conscious about storytelling, this thing that we're doing anyways, unless you're not, in which case I would also like to talk to you. That would be really interesting. There are some questions that we might ask ourselves, and I want to end with some questions, to help us be more conscious about our storytelling. So one question that I thought of was, what stories do I presently feel are the most meaningful and wise? I don't know. It's an interesting question. Probably changes. But it's good to ask ourselves. Another question, what false and perhaps toxic stories from the media or culture have slipped their way into my consciousness? Short story about this. I find myself, I'm 27, almost 28 now, and I find myself sort of passing through a cultural gate, as I call it, where it's like there are certain stories about that, for whatever reason, have been put into my consciousness about what I should be doing at this age. And none of those stories involve me sitting here doing this, right? So like, there's some tension there. And I'm realizing now, I'm unearthing the fact that like, yeah, I'm actually like, this is another layer that I've been programmed or been,
false story.
Yeah, enchanted by a story, right? A false story, yeah. So that may show up in all of our lives in so many different ways. And it's one thing that's fascinating to me too is how we're decentering the storytelling from, perhaps the mainstream media into things like Facebook, right? We're telling each other stories on that medium now. And what does that mean? I don't know, but it probably means something. Another question. What story or stories do I subscribe to about political change, power, or progress? Right? We may all have different stories about that. We can't change anything. Like, change is just around the corner. Voting doesn't change anything. Voting is the only thing that matters. It's amazing, like the diversity of stories that we tell about what is meaningful in terms of changing our very sick society. It's good to be conscious about that, to acknowledge that that's a story, and that therefore we can choose a better story, and then act from that better story if we so choose. If we so choose. And then the most interesting question for me right now, living here, is what stories do I want to live? Or what stories do you want to live? Or said in a slightly different way that feels more provocative to me, what stories want to come to life through me? What stories want to come to life through you? Maybe you have a sense of that. Maybe you feel yourself pulled by something, by a story, a beautiful story that wants to come to life through you. Good to know that, right? Yeah, I'll end with two quotes. I like quotes that I found. One is from Gary Snyder. It's a poet, you might say. The world is made of stories. Good stories are hard to come by. And a good story you can honestly call your own is an incredible gift. These stories are part of a bigger story that connects us all. And this last quote is by Lin Yutang. I really like it. It says, "Hope is like a road in the country. There was never a road, but when many people walk on it, the road comes into existence."